Welcome to Blues Stories, a collection of yarns spun by Jason Ricci. In these videos, he will be documenting the true and tall tales of his life and career as a superstar blues, harmonica demon, and god. You will hear first-hand accounts of his rise and fall and strange, seamy encounters with legends and obscure artists alike. Some of the names have been changed to protect the living. There are no innocents in the blues.
Hi, I'm Jason Ricci, and welcome to the very first episode of Blues Stories. Since this is the first episode, I'll give a little intro. What I'm going to be doing is telling stories, documenting my experiences on the road throughout the years with various superstars and not so famous people, and in between stories of debacle and funny situations and stuff. So anyway, this is my vapor, by the way. Since I don't have a pipe and we're in the 21st century, I will be vaping during these stories. So where to begin? Why not at the beginning? Start somewhere near the beginning with one of my very first blues buddies, Mr. Nick Curran. Nicky Curran, as we used to. I grew up in Maine, in a little town called Portland. I started going out to the jams and stuff before I was old enough to get in. There was a club there called the Big Easy. They had a blues jam every Tuesday night. It wasn't your normal blues jam like a lot of you guys who are just getting into blues today know about. This was a jam that was well attended by regular people and musicians, okay? So what you had, okay, was a situation where just because you showed up with a guitar or a harmonica or a saxophone didn't guarantee at all that you were going to play, okay? As a matter of fact, you may sit for 6 or 8 months or longer before you got to play. And if you got up, and if you sucked, you got down immediately. The primary purpose of the blues jam was to sell beer for the club. That's why it continued for years and years and years. The byproduct of this was an incredible breeding ground, even though it was in Maine, of all places, for some fantastic musicians. And besides yours truly, even greater is the one I'm here to tell you about today, young Mr. Nicky Curran. So I meet Nicky. I think he was about 16. Maybe he was younger. Maybe he was 14. I don't fucking remember. Okay, he was young. Okay, no, and I think he had his driver's license, so he had to be at least 15. In Maine, you could get your driver's license when you were 15. And right away, Nicky had like the old car, like I don't really think about cars, but it was one of those 50s cars and shit like that. And he was real into this type of music. He was already playing at the Blues Jam when I met him. I think so was I. I think we had already met after we had kind of cut our teeth and got on stage and stuff. And yeah, he was one of the good people. A lot of the people in Maine, a lot of the older players actually feared when Nick walked in because he was that good. I'm going to tell you stories about how good Nick was. So, I mean, the kid could play guitar. He was studying with Ronnie at the time. He was like a tape recorder. I mean, anything he heard, he could just play it back, just immediately. It was incredible, okay? And I don't know if in between the times, I used to see him at least every Tuesday, sometimes more. But I think all he did was play guitar. Like, I don't think he did anything else and sing. I mean, every single week he was getting better and better. He was into blues. He was into old rock and roll. He was into Little Richard. He was into Elvis. He was into Brian Setzer and rockabilly and all of that kind of stuff. And he was, I don't know how to say this without it sounding unbelievable. He was adept at all of those styles. Like when I say adept, he could play Otis Rush, or he could play Son House, or he could play Ronnie Earl, or he could play Robin Ford. Okay, so it's not just one guy or two in that style, it was all of them. I think at that time he was mostly influenced by Ronnie, okay, obviously. And growing up in Maine, in that area, Ronnie was a big force, okay. Anyway, I got to know him and I got to play with him. I got to play with him in a lot of bands. Here's some interesting facts. Nick Curran subbed for musicians in Maine on guitar and on bass and on drums. Okay, he did all of those things. He could also play a variety of other instruments, including harmonica and piano. But those were his big three. I'll start with this story. So there was this band in Maine called the Memphis Mafia. They had to change their name because of legal battles with actually Elvis's official bodyguard organization. Found out about them and made them change their name. They changed their name to King Memphis and the Monarchs. Nicky loved them. Loved them. He used to go to see them all the time. They were great. They had the old tube mics and they used to record and it sounded like it was recorded in the 50s. And I know you're thinking in Maine, but I swear to God, this shit was fucking great. It was as good as it gets. It's like as good as I've ever seen, you know. So Nick hung out with him all the time, right? And he'd play guitar, you know, sometimes, and he'd be in the band every now and then. I'm not sure if he was an official member of the band. I think the answer to that question is no. He was just somebody he hung out with. Here's the story. So one day, the bass player, upright, doghouse, slap bass. One day the bass player can't come to the gig because he's sick. So this is how Nick Curran handles this situation. So I think they called him and said, do you know anybody, right? Like, or something like that, right? Like, do you know anybody who can do the gig? And Nick was like, yeah, I can do it. And there was an issue because there was no upright bass. Now, first of all, I don't even know that Nick ever played an upright bass, nor did anybody else in town, okay? This was completely, like, uncharted territory. Nobody had ever seen him play an upright bass, okay? So he shows up to the gig, and this is what happens, okay? This is the bass. He took a dresser drawer from his house, okay, and then he created a false front out of a piece of plywood that was like a fake hourglass, like a fucking double bass, right? And he cut the little F hole, or he painted the F holes into it, and it had a 2x4 for a neck with 3 clotheslines, vinyl clotheslines on it for strings, and I guess he had some kind of tuning peg system set up, okay? And he would undrill it with an electric drill before the set. And he took a 58, an SM58 microphone, put a sock around it, stuck it in the thing, and then re-drilled the false front on it. And that was the bass. Okay, that's what he showed up to the gig with, to play the gig. And so here's the part that you just had to be there. It was fucking perfect. Okay, I mean, like, it sounded awesome. And Nick was amazing. He was like... I mean, just like amazing. Like, he wasn't even looking at the bass. And there's no frets on the thing. Okay, there's no lines, there's nothing. He's just looking out and just rocking. Yeah, it's fucking unfucking believable, okay? Another night, right, one night he just decides to just do Elvis. And it's like the best Elvis impersonator to date that I've ever seen. And it was just out of nowhere. Just like this kid was just like that. It was unbelievable. Story, okay? But he was also fucking pretty weird and like socially awkward. He was from like definitely like country area of Maine, you know what I mean? He like stayed overnight at my house. We only ever talked about music, pretty much. And musicians around town and famous musicians and shit. I get this gig in Boston at this place called the Midway Cafe in Jamaica Plains, pretty sure. So I bring Nick to do the gig, okay? And he's like not old enough to be going with me. And I think I'm like 20, maybe 21 or something. I'm back from Jackson, Mississippi, hanging out in Maine for a little while. And I hire Nicky to come do the gig. We're on our way back from the gig. And I really want to smoke a joint, okay? So I'm telling Nick that I'm going to smoke a joint because Nicky hates pot. Okay, hates pot. Hates it. All right. At that time in his life, it was like the worst thing ever, and you were a bad guy if you did it, right? That's how fucking precious and naive and like an untouched fucking flower this kid was, okay? He was just entirely about music. So anyway, I'm like, fucking Nick, chill, dude. Like, and he's in the back of the van, and I think I had a bass player. You know, I can't remember where the rest of the band was. Did we pick them up in Boston? I don't even remember, okay? All I remember is Nick and I in the van, okay? Anyway, Nick goes into the van. It's a Chevy Astro cargo van, so there's no seats in the back, okay? And we're going like 70 miles an hour down the highway, and I light up the joint, and he just fucking opens the sliding, like the giant sliding door, because he's so fucking freaked out that he's going to inhale secondhand weed smoke. And we're going 70, and he almost falls out of the car, like while we're flying down the highway just to avoid secondhand weed smoke. That's one of the many Nick Curran stories, okay, that I got. Okay, but that's a good one. So, if you don't know who Nick Curran is, you know, a few years after that, he went on the road with Ronnie Dawson. He moved to Texas. He played with a variety of people in Austin and around there. And then he went on to play with the Fabulous Thunderbirds and Kim Wilson and all those guys. He was very good friends with Kirk Fletcher while he was in that band. He was very close friends with Preston Hubbard. Preston has lots of great Nicky stories, too. And he was very close friends with Jimmy Vaughn, who played on his record. And I was fortunate enough to play on Nick's last record, Reform School Girl. And I think that was the name of it. His recordings are unbelievable. They're just absolutely unparalleled. I'm not a traditionalist. I don't like new music that pretends or tries to be traditional or retro. But Nick's the one exception to that because it's so incredible. I've heard stories that Nick used to put on his own music in the van with the Thunderbirds, and he would ask Kim Wilson who he thought it was, and Kim would say Little Richard. That's the kind of thing that Nick was capable of doing. Later in Nick's life, he got into punk and punk rock and stuff like that. I tried. This is a great thing about blues stories. I'm going on record as saying I tried to turn Nick on to the Ramones and the Misfits when we were kids, and he wasn't having it. Okay, so later in life, you know, he kind of got into that. Nick went through many transformations of, like, you know, with the pompadour and the rockabilly thing to like complete straight blues to when he finally found himself at the end. He was just Nick, who was a total crazy punk rock and roller kid. He died 2 years ago when he was 35 years old of oral cancer. This is our second Christmas without Nick, which is what reminded me of to do this, open with these blues stories. Plus, I wanted to open with a pretty benign one that wasn't so inflammatory. So I thought
about someone that I know you have quite a bit of love.
I miss him. I miss him a lot. I highly encourage everybody. Sorry to interrupt you, babe.
Go on.
Okay. I highly encourage everybody out there to go check out Nick's music, to go check him out on YouTube. He's one of the greatest artists that I've ever seen in my entire life. And these are just only a few stories. I had not planned them in my head before I sat down here. This is just what come off the top of my head right now when I think of Nicky. Do you have something else?
I know that even just going to a show a couple months ago to Brent Johnson's show, we were surprised with a story about Nicky.
Yeah. There's lots.
So there are a lot.
There are a lot of great, and we're gonna have Brent Johnson on Blues Stories. By the way, we're having a special guest contributor to Blues Stories. But today's Blues Stories is all about Nicky, and there's a lot of people out there that everybody that ever knew Nicky was a great admirer of him. And I don't know one person that ever met Nick Curran that didn't have some kind of a life-changing, jaw-dropping experience. He was a consummate musician, an incredible performer, a very humble and dedicated, unique musician that the world is going to miss forever. I'm Jason Ricci, and that concludes episode 1.